A Boeing 737-800 is lining up for their final approach when suddenly the autopilot starts turning the aircraft in the wrong direction. How many technical faults does it take before pilots start distrusting their aircraft, and what happens when they do? Stay tuned. A huge thank you to Brilliant for sponsoring this video. In the morning of the 30th of December 2016, a crew from Royal Air Maroc was getting ready to fly their Boeing 737-800 from Rabat Saleh International Airport in Morocco up towards Paris-Orly Airport in France. The flight crew consisted of a very experienced 47-year-old captain, and he was flying together with a 30-year-old senior first officer, both of them quite experienced on this aircraft type. Together with them was 4 cabin crew members, and the pilots were looking very carefully onto their pre-flight briefing material because they could see that the weather at their destination, Paris-Orly, was not going to be very good. It was forecasted to be fog, even freezing fog with very poor visibility. The way this works is that if you're departing on an IFR flight plan, which commercial flights always are, you need to make sure that the weather at your destination is good enough for you to start an approach with the available minimum approach aids. So in the case of Paris-Orly, that's something called a Category 3 ILS approach. That means that the pilots can go down to as low visibility as 200 meters, and they need to be able to see the runway at about 50 feet height, just as they pass the threshold of the runway. But you also need to be able to go to your alternate. And your alternate airport actually needs better weather than that. So if the alternate airport is also equipped to allow Category 3 ILS approaches, well then you need to have weather good enough to do a Category 1 ILS approach at your alternate. So instead of 200 meters visibility, you now need normally around 550 meters visibility. If there's no Cat 3 available at your alternate, well then you're going to need non-precision approach minima. The rules have been made in this way so that if something would happen to the aircraft with your instrumentation, for example, when you're flying into your destination, you'll still be able to divert and do a successful approach into your alternate because the weather is supposed to be better there. You can also depart towards your destination if the weather is worse than your best available approach there, but in that case you need to carry enough fuel to be able to bring you to 2 good alternates where the weather is better than the second best approach aids. But on this morning, the crew saw that the weather was going to be good enough to fly a Category 3 ILS approach in Paris-Orly, and that the weather in Lyon was a bit marginal, but it was still better than Category 1, which means that they legally had the weather needed in order to go towards Paris. But because the weather was a little bit marginal, the captain decided to uplift 1 ton more than the minimum required fuel. This would enable him to go in and sit and wait in a holding, for example, in case there were queues coming into Orly, or if they encountered some other problems, they would just have a little bit more time. The pilots then continued through their briefing pack and they looked at their NOTAMs. NOTAMs is a list of items that might not be working properly en route, for example, navigational aids, or at the airport of arrival, or at the alternate. So you have to go through that list fairly carefully because there might be things in there that precludes you from flying, for example, a Cat 3 ILS. But they couldn't find anything of interest, so they proceeded to brief the cabin crew and then they walked out to the aircraft. While they were walking out to the aircraft, they decided that the captain was going to be pilot flying for this first flight. And when they got into the cockpit, the captain took up the aircraft technical logbook. Checking the technical logbook is really important as well, because there might be things in there that precludes you from flying certain procedures, for example a Category 3 ILS, because it needs the aircraft to have certain systems functioning. The captain looked through the hold item list, which is where all of the current defects of the aircraft is listed, but there was nothing there. According to the tech log, the aircraft was perfectly fine. Now, what the captain didn't know was that this particular aircraft actually had quite a lot of problems during the 6 months before this flight. Specifically, it had problems with the left side Air Data Inertial Reference Unit, it's ADIRU. Now, the 737-800 has 2 ADIRUs, okay? And what they do is they basically gather all of the information from all of the different probes outside of the aircraft, like the pitot-static tube, the static probe, temperature probes, alpha vanes, things like that. But also, it combines this information together with information from its IRS units, its Inertial Reference System. The inertial reference system is basically a set of 3 laser gyros and 3 accelerometers that continuously update information about the position of the aircraft. It gives information like heading, track, ground speed, attitude, things like this. And it feeds this into the ADIRU, and the ADIRU takes this information, combines it with all of the other information, and then brings that into the flight control computer on that side. So there are 2 ADIRUs, there are 2 flight control computers, and they are connected to each of the screens normally, together with the flight directors and the autopilots. So this information is really important. And if there's something wrong with the information that's coming from the ADIRU, well then that information might be erroneously fed to the flight control computers that then controls the autopilot and the flight directors, which are showing the pilot how they're supposed to be flying the aircraft. The left ADIRU, the one on the captain's side, had actually been replaced twice during the last 6 months because it had been sending faulty information and the pilots had been receiving fault messages during flight. But after each time this happened, the problems couldn't be reproduced on the ground when the maintenance organization dealt with it, so they were intermittent. The maintenance crew had received the aircraft with these problems reported by the pilots. They had, in some cases, exchanged the ADIRU. On other occasions, they couldn't reproduce the fault, so they would have just checked through what the fault this was, try to isolate it. Since it couldn't be isolated, it would have been cleared, the system would have tested, it would have worked fine, and then the aircraft was released again. There was also another problem that this aircraft had, and that was an intermittent issue with the connection between the right radio altimeter and the flight control computer. And again, this was an intermittent fault. So it had been reported on 1 flight and then it would work perfectly for 5 flights and then it would come back again. And the maintenance organization had again replaced part of this system but never really been able to identify where the problem was. And since there was no current fault on any of these systems, the maintenance organization had let the aircraft out and according to them it was clear of faults. So there was nothing written in the tech log and there was no way really for the captain to know that this aircraft had this history unless he would have gone very, very far back to look at all of the faults that happened during the last 6 months, which you can't really expect him to do. And even if he would have done that, since all of the problems would have been rectified by maintenance, there was no reason for them to believe that any of this persisted. So the pilots completed their pre-flight preparation, they boarded their 149 passengers, they pushed back and started taxiing out for takeoff. At time 0746, Royal Air Maroc flight 780 Sierra took off from runway 03 in Rabat. The captain brought the landing gear up and engaged Command A just per normal and then continued a normal climb up towards Paris-Orly. About 1 hour into the flight, the first sign of a problem appeared to the crew. And this came in the form of a control display unit message saying IRS left drift. The crew didn't really recognize this message. They hadn't seen it before and they started taking up their manuals looking for what this message actually meant, but they couldn't find any kind of reference to the message. Later on, it turned out that the reason they didn't have any information about this was because Royal Air Maroc had received a service bulletin from Boeing saying that they needed to update their software for their FMCs. And they had done so. They had updated to the newest software, but they had failed to tell Boeing that they had complied with this service bulletin. And because of that, Boeing hadn't sent the new information about all of the updated messaging back towards Royal Air Maroc. So the crew was looking for this message, they couldn't find it, but they kind of had an idea what it was, so they went into a separate sub-menu inside of the flight management computer and they looked at the position and the speed of each IRS. And they found out that the left IRS was in a significantly different position than the right IRS, and the speed was also different. So this made them believe that, okay, we have potentially an issue with the left IRS. But they also noticed that it looked like the IRS position and speed started converging with the right IRS. So this led them to believe that the system was actually correcting itself. So they left it behind, they couldn't find any more information anyway, and they started concentrating on getting weather for Paris-Orly because they were now getting closer to their destination. As expected, the weather in Paris-Orly was not good. The visibility was varying between 400 to 450 meters with light wind from a variable direction and a temperature of -2 degrees. So the captain started setting up and preparing for a Category 3 ILS approach, just that they had planned with on their briefing stage. Now, when we fly a Category 3 ILS approach, the procedures are a little bit different than a normal approach. And that's because a Category 3 ILS approach is flown like an autoland, which means the aircraft is going to land by itself. In order for the aircraft to be able to do so, we need to engage both autopilots in command. And we can only do so after we have been cleared for the approach and we've armed the approach mode on the autopilot. So the captain briefed this, they set their minimus independently on each side to 50 feet radio, and after the briefing was completed, they requested descent and they started descending in towards Paris. During the descent, the crew got a second warning on their FMC CDU. This time it said verify position IRS IRS. This warning they did have some guidance for, but since they were in the descent and they had already looked at the IRS issue since before, they assumed that this problem is the same as before. We already checked it, it was sorting itself out, so they didn't pay any more attention to it. Instead, the crew continued to descend. They changed frequency to the approach controller for Paris-Orly approach, and at time 10:09, Royal Air Maroc flight 780 was cleared to descend to 5,000 feet and turn slightly left to intercept the localizer for runway 06 for a Category 3 ILS approach. When the aircraft intercepted the localizer, it started turning slightly left and right on the localizer. The approach controller saw this happening and he queried the crew as to, are you sure that you are established on the localizer? But he didn't get any response back from the crew, and it's possible that that was because the crew at this point was trying to engage the second autopilot in command. But they hadn't yet been cleared for approach, which means the approach mode wasn't armed, so they couldn't do this. So every time that they switched on command B, that disengaged command A, and they did this a couple of times. At time 10, 13 and 38 seconds, the approach controller again called the crew and asked them to confirm that they were established on the localizer. The crew responded this time and said that they were, and the approach controller handed them over to the tower, but he didn't clear them for approach. So the pilots called up the tower controller, told him that they were established on the localizer, and asked if they were clear for approach. The tower controller said, negative, you're not, call me back when on 5 miles final, which is a little bit weird because in order for the crew to call him at 5 miles final, they obviously needed to follow the ILS approach. So the crew responded to this by asking if they could descend further to 4,000 feet, and that prompted the tower controller to then finally clear them for approach. And when the crew got cleared for approach, the captain engaged approach mode, and this time when he engaged command B, it worked. So now both autopilots were armed for the autoland. But remember how this aircraft had had issues with the connection between the radio altimeter and the flight control computer on the right side? Now that same problem came back again, and because the flight control computer on the right hand side couldn't verify that the information that it was getting from its radio altimeter was correct, it now disengaged command B. So as soon as the captain had engaged command B, it disconnected again. The captain then tries to engage autopilot B a second time. Once again it doesn't work, but the switchover actually causes autopilot A to disconnect. So now the captain has to re-engage autopilot A again, and they realize that something is wrong with the autopilot system. They cannot get the second autopilot to engage, which means that they cannot fly the Category 3 ILS. Now, there's no indication of any problem on the first officer side. There's no radio altimeter flag or anything like this, but they have to discontinue the approach. This happens at 3,250 feet, but the missed approach altitude in Paris-Orly is only 2,000 feet. So this means that they're now above their missed approach altitude. When the crew tells the tower controller that they are unable to continue the Category 3 ILS approach, the tower controller only tells them to level off at 2,000 feet, follow the missed approach procedure, and then to state their intentions. When the crew does this, they clean up the aircraft, they immediately realize that the weather is too poor to do another approach into Paris-Orly. Instead, they have to divert. But luckily, like we discussed earlier, they know that the weather, albeit being a little bit marginal, is still better in Lyon. So they will be able to fly a Category 1 ILS approach there. So at this point, the workload for the pilots is really starting to pick up. They've had a minor issue with the IRS system on the left-hand side, but then they couldn't engage the autopilot on the right-hand side, which doesn't seem to have anything to do with that malfunction. Then they had to do a non-standard missed approach, and now they're in the middle of a diversion, which always comes with more workload, where the pilot needs to talk to the cabin crew, prepare them, they need to liaise with the company to see what to potentially do with the passengers after the diversion, and they also have to start to have a real close look at their fuel state. But things are about to get much, much worse for these pilots, and I'll tell you all about that after this short message from my sponsor, who makes it possible for me to make these kind of videos. Reading text or watching video can be a really great way to learn the basics of a subject, but if you're like me, and I guess that you are, in order to really learn something, you need some hands-on practice. You need to really use the knowledge in order for it to get in here. And this is where the sponsor of today's video, Brilliant, is such a brilliant tool. Because Brilliant is an online interactive STEM learning platform that helps you to get a much deeper understanding of the concepts in maths, science and computer science by taking you through the subjects piece by piece in a really hands-on way. And as an educator myself, I really love how Brilliant is doing this, and I really enjoy using it. If this sounds good to you, well then go down, click on the link below, which is brilliant.org/mentorpilot. It will give you a free 7-day trial where you can check it out. And if you like it, it will give you a further whopping 20% off the premium deal. So go down, click the link and start learning today. During their diversion towards Lyon, the aircraft is now climbing up to the most economic flight level for the diversion. And as they're doing so, the captain is trying to tune a VOR Nav Aid for Lyon. This is a ground-based Nav Aid that they can use to see what direction the airport is at and the distance. But as he's tuning in the frequency, he doesn't seem to be able to get it identified. So instead he takes the identifier for the VOR, which is Lima Sierra Echo, and he puts that into the FMC, and when he does so, the FMC tells him that that Nav Aid is more than 3,000 nautical miles away. And the captain cannot understand why that is, and this is now starting to really sow some doubts in his mind about the navigational status of his aircraft. The reason that this is actually happening is because the Lima Sierra Yankee VOR was actually notamed to be inoperative and was replaced by a temporary nav aid with a different code, but this notam was not in the normal section for the destination and alternate, it was in the en route section, so neither the captain nor the first officer had picked that up. Anyway, as they're now getting closer towards their alternate Lyon, the captain is starting to set up for the Category 1 ILS approach into runway 35 right, and a part of the setup is to calculate the landing distance and also set the outer brake they want for the landing. Captain selects the outer brake setting, but when he does so, he gets an outer brake disarm light, showing that the outer brakes does not seem to work. They take up the QRH non-normal checklist. They go through it, he tries to reset it again, it doesn't work, so he sets it to off. They need to use manual braking, which is not a big deal, but you can start to see here now that there are many different systems that seems to not be connected to each other that are failing. In fact, the outer brake system is using information from the left ADIRU, and because it's not getting correct information, it is now not arming, but the captain has not made that connection yet. At time 10:44 and 43 seconds, the crew is handed over to the Lyon approach controller. This controller tells them to start their descent initially to flight level 90 and then to descend to 3,000 feet for radar vectors in for the ILS approach for runway 35 right in Lyon. 2 minutes later, he tells the crew to turn left onto a heading of 020 degrees, and on this heading they are cleared for the full ILS approach runway 35 right. As the aircraft is now turning left, the captain reaches over and he engages the Vorlock mode on the autopilot. In this mode, the autopilot will capture the localizer signal first of all. The captain then intends to arm the full approach mode so that he can capture the glide slope and start descending down towards the runway. They also start to extend flaps 1, flaps 5 and slow the aircraft down. As the aircraft is getting closer to the localizer, the approach controller hands the aircraft over to the Lyon tower controller. But before the pilots have a chance to call the tower controller, the localizer is captured and the pilots are expecting the aircraft to make a left-hand turn to align itself for runway 35 right. But here something else happens. Remember the small fault that has been creeping into the left IRS system? But now that fault is starting to affect the ADIRU on the left-hand side, which sends signals to the flight control computer that's controlling the autopilot. And instead of the aircraft turning left to intercept the localizer, it now starts banking 30 degrees to the right instead and starts turning onto a heading of 070 degrees, which is almost perpendicular to the intended course. Initially, the pilots don't do anything, they're just monitoring the system, and the captain thinks that they have captured the wrong localizer, which further makes him doubt the information that he's seeing in front of him on his navigation display. The autopilot then starts realizing its mistakes and starts turning towards the left, but soon it becomes apparent to the flight control computer on the left-hand side that it's being fed erroneous information, and it disconnects the autopilot, leaving the captain to hand fly the aircraft once again. But the aircraft is now 1.6 nautical miles away from the center line, paralleling the center line down. The first officer now contacts the Lyon tower controller, but as they're doing so, they're on 9 miles final, they're 1.6 miles to the east of the center line, and the captain realizes that he will not be able to stabilize this approach. So once again, the crew tells the controller that they need to go around. The tower controller reads this back and tells the crew that from his perspective, it doesn't seem that they are even close to the localizer signal, and this just reinforces the crew's perception that something is very wrong with their navigational system. They initiate the go-around and they're supposed to climb to 5,000 feet, and the captain is still hand flying, and he flies through the 5,000 feet missed approach altitude and continues up to 5,600 feet, where he engages the command B, and that initiates a slight descent back to 5,000 feet. The crew is told to go back onto the Lyon approach controller frequency, and the approach controller gives the crew a vector down towards the south to start preparing for another approach. But now things are about to get really hairy, because as the aircraft finalizes its turn, a limit value is exceeded inside of the left ADIRU. This causes an Irs Fault warning to appear on the Irs panel. It also causes a master caution warning for the pilots, and it disconnects the autopilot, removes the flight directors on the left-hand side, and the pitch, roll and heading information for the captain. The captain continues to hand fly the aircraft, and there is an Irs Fault non-normal checklist to be done. But now the workload has gotten so high for this crew that the captain, instead of calling for that checklist, just does one of the items that he remembers from memory, which is he puts the Irs transfer switch from normal to both on right. That action forms a part of the checklist. However, there are many other important things inside of the checklist as well. For example, it tells the crew to not use the autopilot for the approach. But the captain feels that now they have done a diversion and another go-around. They're running low on fuel. He needs to hurry things up. He needs to get this aircraft down on the ground, and he does not understand why all of these systems are malfunctioning for him. As this is happening, the captain is still hand flying the aircraft, but with very limited instrumentation until he switches over the IRSs to both on right. And since he's doing this by memory, he's not paying much attention to the limited instrumentation that he has, which means he has missed that he's climbed the aircraft from 5,000 feet up to 6,500 feet. When he realizes this, he reaches over and he engages the command B. He also engages the auto throttle, and the aircraft once again descends back to 5,000 feet. The pilots are now starting to discuss how to proceed with this flight, if they are going to go for a second approach into Lyon or if they're going to divert further down to Marseille. They took some weather for Marseille during their flight in towards Paris, but that was a long time ago now, and they are not sure that the weather is still good in Marseille. They go into their ACAR system, which stands for Aircraft Communication Address and Reporting System, but they only get a message of ACARS NOCOM, which means that ACARS is not receiving any information. So based on the fact that they don't know what the weather is like in Marseille, they take the decision to do another approach into Lyon. But they have this perceived time pressure. They haven't actually looked too closely on how much fuel they actually have available. And if they would have done so, they would have recognized that that extra ton that they carried from Rabat is actually helping them quite a lot here. It will enable them to hold for almost 20 minutes before they can do that next approach into Lyon, and they would still land with more than their final reserve fuel. And those 20 minutes they could have used to systematically go through the non-normal checklist of the Irs Fault, for example, which would have given them better guidance and a better foundation to stand on for their next approach. But that doesn't happen. Instead, the crew is now preparing to do a fast second approach in towards Lyon. And from the communications that is happening from now on, there's a clear sound in their voices that they're starting to be really, really stressed about the situation. And I kind of understand that as well. Because not only are these guys dealing with the time pressure and that the fact that they've done 2 go-arounds in marginal weather, they're also doubting their systems. They're doubting whether or not what they see in front of them is actually accurate. And they don't really understand why all of these failures keep happening. So the workload must have been tremendous at this point, and it's going to start to affect their crew resource management from this point onwards. The fact that the captain switched the IRS mode selector over to both on right has restored the instrumentation on both primary flight displays. But the captain still takes the decision that it's probably better for the first officer to be pilot flying, since the instrumentation seems to be working better on his side. So he hands over the controls to the first officer and he takes on the radio. He now also calls up the Lyon approach controller and tells him that they're having issues with their position. This is the first time that any of the controllers have been told the kind of technical problems that the crew is facing. The approach controller acknowledges this and gives him a right turn vector onto heading of 355 degrees to intercept the localizer again from runway 35 right. As the aircraft is turning onto this heading, suddenly the yaw damper stops working. Now that would also probably have felt like a really random fault for this crew. I mean, it doesn't seem to be connected to any of the other technical malfunctions they're experiencing. But in fact, this is a feature of the Boeing 737. If they are flying with the autopilot engaged with an Irs fault, the yaw damper is designed to trip off 30 seconds after the autopilot is engaged to make sure that any faulty signals that are being sent from the IRSs doesn't cause also the yaw damper to start turning the aircraft the wrong way. But of course, this is very, very deep technical knowledge, and it's very unlikely that the crew, being under such extreme workload as they are at that point, would be able to remember something like that. The crew does not carry out the accurate checklist associated with the yaw damper failure because they're now intercepting the localizer. When the aircraft intercepts the glide slope, once again the faulty connection between the radio altimeter on the right hand side and the flight control computer disrupts the signals to the autopilot B. In this case, it disconnects the autopilot B and it also removes the flight directors from both pilots. This means that from this point onwards, the crew is going to have to hand fly a raw data Ils approach. And I just want to make this clear that we do practice hand flying raw data approaches in the simulator. It's actually a really, really good crew resource management exercise because the workload would increase tremendously on the pilot flying. The pilot flying now needs to anticipate thrust level movements, because every time that you add thrust, the aircraft is going to pitch up a little bit. When you take it off, it's going to pitch down. The same goes for when you're changing configuration. And you are required to increase your instrument scan speed enormously. Because if you are focusing too much on, for example, maintaining the localizer, then you're likely going to lose the glide slope. And if you then focus too much on the glide slope, you might lose the speed. When you have the flight director takes care of most of this. You don't need to scan that quickly. But this also means that you have to time, for example, when you do your landing checklist to make sure that the pilot flying is not correcting while you're starting the checklist so that he or she cannot follow and check the checklist properly. But of course, in this case, the crew is already under a tremendous amount of workload and they haven't pre-briefed this and they haven't mentally prepared for it. So as this is happening and the first officer is pilot flying, he just hands over the controls to the captain. Remember, this happens just as the aircraft intercepts the glide slope, so the aircraft are going to need to push down immediately in order to follow the glide slope down. The captain does this, but he overdoes it a little bit. He increases the vertical speed too much and he starts to go below the glide slope. At time 11:08 and 38 seconds, the captain calls up the approach controller and tells him that he's continuing the approach manually. This doesn't make any sense to the approach controller. So he calls him up and asks to confirm that you have the runway in sight, to which the captain responds negative. So the captain is now both handling the radio and hand flying the aircraft, and it's likely that he's doing so because this all happened so quickly that he didn't have time to formally hand over the radio to the first officer. From this point onwards, the next calls that's coming from the captain to air traffic control are done in French, which is the captain's native tongue. This is another sign of potential overload for the captain, because up until this point he's been doing everything in English, but now he's reverting back to French. The captain asks the approach controller to please confirm that they're on the correct localizer, once again indicating that he doesn't really trust the instrumentation that he have in front of him. The approach controller responds that he cannot confirm to them that they have the correct glide and localizer capture, but that it looks good from his point of view. The approach controller now tells the crew to switch over to the Lyon Tower frequency, and at this point the first officer takes over the radio and switches over. They select gear down, and as they pass 950 feet, they are 2 dots low on the glide slope, and a GPWS glide slope warning is issued. This coincides with a minimum safe altitude warning at the approach controller station, but of course he has handed the crew over to the tower controller, so he cannot warn them. The first officer now gets into contact with the tower, and the approach is continuing well outside of the stabilized approach criteria. They are still more than 1.5 dot low, and they're now starting to deviate left of the center line as well. The tower controller can see this, and he asks the crew if they are visual with the runway, and they respond negative. The ground proximity warning system continues to issue glide slope warning, and it also gives out a sink rate warning when the descent rate goes over 2,250 feet per minute. At 560 feet above ground, the aircraft is at 162 knots and the speed is increasing. They are 1.4 dots below the glide slope, and the first officer now calls up the tower and says, "We are go around Air Maroc." As he's calling this, the aircraft comes out below the clouds, and the pilots can start seeing the runway. They realize that they are in between runway 35 right and 35 left, and that they are very, very low. The captain decides to continue the approach and sidestep to the right in order to align himself with the localizer for runway 35 right. At 400 feet, they're still not in landing configuration, and they have a speed of 178 knots as they continue the approach. The first officer now contacts the tower again and tells them that actually we are going to continue the approach. At 240 feet, they receive a too low terrain warning from the EGPWS. The tower calls them up and asks them confirm that you have the runway in sight, to which the crew responds affirmative. They continue the approach, and as they descend through 180 feet, they're still 1 kilometer short of runway 35 right. They get more too low terrain warnings, but they continue in towards the landing anyway. The crew is now clear to land, and as they pass 80 feet, they select flaps 40 for the landing. 10 seconds later, the aircraft touches down on runway 35 right. They touch down about 150 meters beyond the landing touchdown zone and at a speed of 159 knots. They decelerate normally and vacate the runway without any further incidents. Once they pull up on stand, they disembark the passengers, and the captain gets into contact with the company. He tells them about all of the different technical malfunctions that they have had. He also put it into the tech log. But he doesn't tell them anything about the non-stabilized approach and the numerous GPWS warnings they'd received. And because of this, they did not pull the cockpit voice recorder circuit breaker, which means that the voice recordings were not saved for the subsequent investigation. All of the things that you've heard here comes from the investigation, which is based on the interviews that they did with the flight crew, the air traffic controllers, and the flight data recorder, which they did have access to. So how come that this happened in the first place then? And how come that the captain decided to continue a clearly non-stabilized approach? Well, the air incident investigation team went through all of the data they had, and they found out that there were some poor practices when it came to reporting technical defects into the technical logbook in Royal Air Maroc. This in turn led to the maintenance department not being able to follow the correct fault isolation techniques that they needed to do, and that allowed these two separate malfunctions to be carried on to the incident flight. Those two malfunctions then interfered with the autopilot system, the flight director system, the yaw damper, the auto brake system in a way that created a lot of mistrust between the crew and the aircraft. This then, together with the perceived time pressure, degraded the crew resource management inside of the flight deck to a point where the captain just wanted to get the aircraft down on the ground. And that's what he said to the investigators, that once he saw the runway, he heard that the first officer was calling for a go-around, but he said, I don't want to continue to fly this aircraft with these failures anymore. I can see the runway over there. I'm just going to put it down on the ground and get it to an engineer. The really incredible thing here is that after this had happened, Royal Air Maroc called in a line maintenance engineer that went out to try to deal with the aircraft. But once again, he couldn't reproduce the faults once the aircraft was started up and checked on the ground. So it ended up with the same pilot flying the same aircraft on the same day back to Paris Orly again, where they picked up the passengers, and then they flew the aircraft down to Marrakech. And on approach into Marrakech, with the first officer was pilot flying, once again the autopilot disconnected. There were several recommendations that came out of this investigation. A few of them were aimed at Boeing for letting an Irs fault like this affect the flight control computers in a way that the aircraft could start turning away from the intended flight path. But there was also feedback to Royal Air Maroc on the way that the captains wrote down issues in the technical logbook needed to be more exact and to cover all of the different faults that they had experienced. There was also some feedback on how the crew had handled the technical malfunction management and the use of Curate checklist. And the two pilots were issued with some ground school training and also 2 4-hour simulator sessions, which was focused on issues with the Irs systems and how to fly raw data approaches manually. Now, if you want to continue binge watching air accidents and incidents, then check out this video up here. I hope that you have seen and subscribed to my new channel, Mentour now, where I do more technical content about aviation. If you want to support the channel, consider becoming part of my Patreon crew. It's hugely appreciated. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.